Hello and welcome to today's episode of Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Prashant and today we'll be looking at yet another Israeli airstrike on Syria, the latest on the Omicron front, and the impact of the gutting of the Build Back Better bill in the United States. Our first story is from Syria, where state media has reported an Israeli airstrike on the vital port of Latakia on Tuesday morning. According to the Syrian Arab news agency or SANA, several missiles hit the port early in the morning. This is the second attack on the port this month. Israel does not comment on such strikes usually, and a military spokesperson followed their trend, saying that they do not comment on foreign news reports. The Syrian news agency said that the strikes had caused a fire, and the containers that were hit had spare parts for cars and machines. We have with us Prabir to discuss these strikes. Prabir, over the past few years, Israel is believed to have had hundreds of strikes on Syria, and there have been, I think, over 10 in the past 2 months alone. So what exactly is Israel's game plan in Syria and with these airstrikes?
Well, one part of it is clearly the tension between Iran and Israel, and the fact that Israel wants to keep the pot boiling with military strikes of different kinds and also covert action as a pressure, according to them, on Iran's nuclear plans.
Right.
And the threat that if they don't stop, then US and Israel can together hit Iran. Now, that's a backdrop which you have been seeing a cat and mouse game played over West Asia, including ships, transport of different kinds, and in which there has been always this undeclared covert action, so to say, in which military strikes of different kinds, sabotage attempts are always being attempted against each other. This, of course, is also against Syria, and
Right.
Syria is a major player. They have been trying very hard to keep Syria on the back foot. We had insurgencies over there in which Israel tacitly or actively, and which it encouraged, and also supported military strikes on occasions. And of course, we have had, on the guise of striking at Iranian positions, really striking at Syrian forces, and also Syrian support to essentially Hezbollah in Lebanon. So all of this has been a part of the mix. And again, it's clear Latakia is also important. It is the major commercial port for Syria, and also very close to the Humaimim air base, which is where you have the Russian Air Force located, which provides support and cover for a lot of the Syrian operations. So it is in that sense also an indirect pressure on the Russian Air Force in Syria. So I think this is really something that we're going to see till the nuclear issue gets resolved one way or the other in the JCPOA negotiations, which seem to be at the moment moribund, or at least in the last stage of dying.
Right.
So we have to see whether each side rethinks this, particularly the United States, who walked out of JCPOA. And Israel has been trying to instigate military action the US takes against Iran. And all of this are essentially attempts to provoke if Iran can be made to act, and then US gets dragged into the Israel-Iran conflagration, which could start again in Syria.
Right.
So I think these are all imponderables at the moment, but clearly Israel has been doing this now for quite some time, and this is one of many instances of strikes in the region and against Syrian forces.
Right. So, Prabir, the Syrian conflict has also been going on for over a decade now, and we know that there have been a lot of ups and downs. But over the past few years, it has seemed like the Assad government has pretty much stabilized itself. You know, the lines have been more or less clearly drawn. Of course, Turkey intervening, Israel intervening, all these countries have been intervening. But there does seem to be some sort of an equilibrium that has sort of emerged. So do you see the Assad government in any sense being affected by these continuous attacks that Israel is doing, or is it more of a diversionary tactic?
Well, clearly the Assad government has consolidated itself, and attempts to have holdouts now are there only in a few pockets. One backed by Turkey and the other backed by the United States and another backed by Israel. There are these pockets which exist on certain boundaries which Syria has with other countries. Of course, not with US. US has marked an enclave for itself. So this is the situation where Syria has actually won the internal war. Assad's government is very much today in in control of Syria. And the only major issue is still with the Turkish border and also with Turkish forces who occupy a part of Syria. And the forces it is supporting, of course, are extremely right-wing Islamist forces, and which would have been considered ISIS, Al-Qaeda affiliates, except for the part that they are attacking Syria. And therefore, they are good guys in the books of the Americans and the NATO.
So thank you, Prabir. We'll come back to you for the next story as well. And our next story is on the latest from the COVID-19 scenario. On December 27th, the US recorded close to 230,000 cases and the UK close to 100,000 cases. Many are expressing concern over the impact of these numbers as well as the holiday season itself on treatment. For instance, The Guardian, quoting an expert, said on Monday that as much as 40% of National Health Service staff in London alone could be absent because of rising COVID-19 infections. Now, this is the worst case scenario, of course. On the other hand, the declining number of cases in South Africa and even perhaps in the UK do give hope. A key question is India, which of course once again is seeing a slight rise in cases. So let's get back once again to Prabir for more. Prabir, of course the data is a bit limited, it's a bit patchy, but any quick thoughts on the emerging global trend looking at the numbers?
I think we have to accept that once Omicron has started spreading, and it has spread in Africa, it started to see increased numbers, for instance, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and of course you have the cases in Europe, particularly European Union and the United States. So if you really see how Omicron is spreading, it's really spreading in dense urban pockets. Right. That's where it has really started to spread first. And if you look at Europe and United States, it's very clear that these are the pockets which are going up pretty rapidly. You talked about the Omicron rise in London. London is almost 80% of the UK's cases. So that is the key issue. But of course, now we will see other areas in UK also going up. The key issue here is that what its impact will be on the general population in terms of serious cases. How fast will it rise? And is it true that it will fall quite rapidly once it crests? Then it starts declining quite rapidly. These are the issues which have public health implications. So if you see what we are seeing in South Africa and what perhaps we are seeing in UK, it seems that the wave is very rapid, but after that you start to see an early decline. It doesn't stay up for too long.
Right.
So again, these are outliers or these are really trends we need to see. The other issue that is very clearly there, that the numbers, because they are so high, of course, there is an implication for the number of people who can reach the hospitals. Right. Because it will become serious cases. I'm not going into the fact that the more serious cases tend to be apparently among the unvaccinated, but it also means the national health system, for instance, in UK, the hospital staff, they must be fit to be able to perform the duties. And the fact that you're saying 40% are out means they're also getting infected, and that's because, of course, it is what's called it is vaccine escape. Right. That people who are infected or have had 2 shots or even sometimes 3 shots, as we see in Israel, they still seem to show COVID-19 infections, and that's the Omicron effect, that it is capable of immune escape. So that is the issue that is there. Is it lower in intensity, less people falling seriously ill? Is it because that Omicron itself is not causing as serious an illness as the Delta variant, for example? Or is it because of the fact that people who are already vaccinated or have had infections have immunity in their bodies, right, and therefore they are able to fight off the serious cases that don't become seriously ill? Is that the reason? Jury's out on that one, that it's definitely true that those who have been vaccinated, who have earlier had COVID-19 infections, they are probably less likely to fall seriously ill. But if the numbers go up rapidly, and numbers are going up very rapidly in most parts of the world, then what is the net impact we don't know, particularly if the hospital staff fall ill and therefore are not able to cater to the large number of patients they are likely to see. We are going to get into an Omicron wave virtually in every country. I think it's just a question of matter of time, whether it is 2 weeks hence, 4 weeks hence, or 6 weeks hence. But I think this is a wave which will go all over the world, as did the Delta wave.
Absolutely. And of course, countries like the India and the US have issued emergency authorizations for vaccines, for drugs. So do you think these could probably play a role in helping counter the worst impact of the wave?
You see, I don't think vaccines will immediately have a major impact in reducing the numbers, at least in countries where the numbers are already going up. But it certainly will have an impact on reducing the serious cases that end up in hospitals. But as I said, it's a question of numbers. The other part that you have raised, that we have new vaccines coming out. So it's particularly countries like India, different parts of Africa. We have other vaccines also, not just the mRNA vaccines. And these are not amenable, they're not that, they don't need to be maintained at a very low temperature, which is what the mRNA vaccines had to be. Particularly if you take the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, they have to be maintained at very low temperatures, which is difficult for essentially poor countries. So therefore, the new viral vaccines coming out is certainly a positive sign. And India has also instituted emergency use for such another set of vaccines, and they probably get into the booster doses. Coming back to the emergency use for antivirals, yes, there are two sets of antivirals which are available, one from Pfizer, one from Merck. And we have to see how much they can how much they can help by keeping the seriousness of the cases under control. And both of them have the antiviral, so they have this effect. Molnupiravir has some cautions that have been given, therefore are going to have probably see more restricted use. The other one, which is a combination of two antivirals, which is from Pfizer, that seems to be more effective and can be used much more widely. Again, the question is how much will it reach different parts of the world, and will it reach there in time to handle this particular phase of the epidemic? We'll have to see.
Right. Thanks, Prabir. A lot to watch out for in the coming weeks and months, definitely then. And finally, a few days ago, West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin announced that he would not support US President Joe Biden's $1.75 trillion Build Back Better plan. We had discussed some of the key ways in which this would impact the people of the United States. Today, we'll hear from Eugene Puryear on the concrete effect the setback to the bill will have on the people of the United States, especially the poor and working class. Eugene also talks about whether there are chances for some of the proposals to be passed individually as smaller bills. Listen in.
I think the at least temporary defeat, but what seems like a permanent defeat for the Build Back Better agenda is going to have a huge impact on working families. First and foremost, this means that there is not going to be an extension of the child tax credit, which has given hundreds of dollars for a number of months now to families that are just doing their best to make it. And it also means that moving forward, a number of critical proposals will not be seen in terms of Medicare, for instance, which is the healthcare system for older Americans, and in many ways is one of the better forms of healthcare that is affordable for people in this country. There is not going to be extended coverage for vision, for dental, for hearing aids, for things like that people critically need, which means a number of poor working class seniors will continue to essentially have to move without the correct healthcare that they should be able to have, to be able to live a full life, because there is not going to be a Build Back Better agenda. It certainly means, as it concerns the issue of climate change, that almost nothing substantive is going to be done this year or almost certainly next year in order to rein in carbon emissions. It also means that the richest people in this country, billionaires that got a huge amount of money over the pandemic, are going to not have any sort of higher taxes for broader provisions. It means that tens of billions of dollars that was going to go to promote affordable housing in a country where millions, tens of millions of people are desperately in need of really any housing, but certainly affordable housing, the 90 billion or so odd dollars that was going to that will not happen. It also means that America's public housing, which is basically turned into a slum system because it's so run down, that billions of dollars that were going to go in to help improve people's living standards there, that also is not going to happen. Other things that were already sort of pre-dropped out of the bill before we even got to this level, but that are also certainly not to happen. There are a number of provisions that were going to make it easier to unionize and things that have been pushed by unions. Now, that had already been dropped out of the bill, but since the bill is not happening in any way, shape, or form, I think it's also worth mentioning that things that would make it easier for workers to join unions, or really, to put it a different way, make it harder for employers to break the law to prevent people from joining unions. That's not going to happen either. And we're going to see many other things. There's other tax credits that are, helping working class people. That's not going to happen. Other expansions of social programs that are out there, none of which seem to be willing to take place. Now, there's a whole discourse about whether or not the bill is dead 100% for sure. But I think it's worth noting here that this means the defeat of the Build Back Better package, that any social legislation to address the basic needs of working and poor people, and honestly, a lot of so-called middle-class people in America, is totally off the table. And the only reason it's off the table is a handful of moderate senators didn't want to increase taxes on billionaires and people with hundreds of millions of dollars. When you really look at it, the big issue with a lot of these programs was not even just that it was one big package, but even how it was going to be put out there. People like Joe Manchin, for instance, who have already said, let's start from scratch and build a new bill. They have very different views in terms of means testing and other things from on social programs that other people don't want to see. There's a lot, each sort of individual program, in a way, part of why nothing has happened this so far on a lot of these issues is people in Congress are so far apart, and there have been multiple proposals coming through the traditional legislative process to deal with a lot of these things as one-offs, and those have totally failed. So I think it's possible. It's an election year, so anything popular always has a chance to pass in an election year. But I think what we've seen now is that the divisions on both the individual bills and the package of the bills, and really the precondition for any of this moving forward, which is significantly higher taxes on the wealthy who pay almost no taxes in the United States right now. That seems to be a non-starter. No Republican is for it. And it looks like a significant minority of Democrats also want to help the rich stay richer. And that underlying fact in and of itself, the inability to go after the pharmaceutical companies' sky high profits and things like that, really make it seem to me that even if there was some desire to move on some of this, how to even raise the money to do it is up in the air. So it's possible. Biden has not really shown a lot of excitement around executive action, so I'm not really looking at that either. But I think, again, that's really going to be a major question of, is there mobilization in 2022 that makes people feel like they have to pass something? And I think that's still an open question.
And that's all we have time for today. We'll be back tomorrow with Daily Debrief. Until then, keep watching People's Dispatch.